Miss Venable here, bringing you a presentation today on weathering. So weathering always breaks down rocks. Weathering is what we call it when rocks break down. And there are two types. There's mechanical or physical weathering, and there is chemical weathering. And those small pieces of rock that get broken down when they're really small, they're called sediment. So here are some examples of physical or what we call mechanical weathering: abrasion, frost wedging, animal interference or plant interference, thermal expansion, exfoliation. Let's look at each of those. So we've all seen abraded rocks. They typically are very smooth. Abrasion is literally friction. So this is what happens when a rock is going down river and it just gets beat and beat and beat and beat against other rocks. And eventually the rock breaks apart into smaller pieces. Frost wedging is when you have a rock that has a little crack in it and water gets in there, and then it freezes and expands and it cools, expands and cools, expands and cools, and eventually the cracks will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you start out with something like a plateau, and it just gets narrower and more cracked up, and eventually you have these little hoodoos, they're called. Pretty cool. Plant roots. Plants can burrow into little cracks in the rock, and the plant root grows bigger and the crack grows bigger along with it. And so eventually you're going to see, like you see in these images, the rock is just sort of breaking apart. And animals can do the same thing. They can get in all the little cracks in the rock and eventually break it apart. Okay, so those are all examples of physical or mechanical weathering. Let's look at some chemical examples. Chemical examples are things like reacting with oxygen, reacting with hydrogen, getting some sulfur dioxide out of the air because of acid rain and having a chemical reaction with that. Some agents of chemical weathering, meaning things that cause chemical weathering or ways that chemicals get into the rocks, are through water or through oxygen or carbon dioxide or even acid rain, and living organisms too. So here's an example. Pretty neat there. You can see a lot of that white stuff is the calcification of the rock, and that's where water has seeped in through cracks in the rock and carried minerals with it. So the water is the essential agent here. Oxygen can do the same thing. This is where oxygen is reacting with some of the iron minerals that are in the rock, and it's forming rust. It's a chemical reaction that kind of forms rust. You can see it looks rust color. Here's some other really cool pictures of that. Examples of weathering. So carbon dioxide might dissolve in rainwater. That creates an acid. It's a weak acid called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid very easily will weather limestone and marble and other soft metals. Carbonation is the reaction with the carbonic acid. That's what we call it. And that forms when the carbon dioxide from the acid rain, from the atmosphere dissolves in the rain. So here's some examples of carbonic acid being carried into a cave. So this is actually seeping in from the surface, and then underneath there's a cave that's slowly eroded out over time, and you can look up on the ceiling of the cave and see all these really cool rock formations. Living organisms can also weather your rocks chemically. They secrete chemicals, and you can see all these little dots on these rocks are actually a kind of a moss called lichen, and they produce some acid as part of their life cycle, and that can chemically weather your rock. Acid rain is a very harsh type of weathering. All the compounds that form in our atmosphere from the burning of coal and oil and other fossil fuels can produce sulfur dioxide, which we call acid rain, and it vastly increases the rate of weathering. So not everything weathers at the same rate. The weathering, if it's more susceptible to weathering, that might be if the rock already has some joints or fractures in it. Here's some examples of that. And where the rock is placed. If it's in a very hot climate, it's going to tend to weather more quickly. If there's a lot of wind or harsh weather beating against the rock, if the soil that it's in is very acidic or moist, all of that affects the weathering. So thank you so much for joining me. This has been my weathering presentation.